So I'm going to tell you a bit about what we do in the UK regarding beef production and genetics and genomics of beef production. So in the UK, I'm responsible for the animal breeding and genomics team of Scotland's Rural College, but also the national genetic and genomic evaluations for dairy, beef, sheep and goats. And predominantly what I'm going to talk to you today is about phenotypes in beef production and how you can use them to improve beef. Genomics in dairy is fairly well established in the UK now. We have a reference population of about 125,000 bulls, and we get about 3,000 a year new ones, and that's predominantly because of a collaboration with the North American Consortium. So the question then was, if we can derive those fantastic benefits for genomic selection for dairy, how can we apply it for beef? And the project I'm going to talk to you about is the project that we've been running for 4 years to apply genomic selection for beef for carcass traits. And now in genotypes, the phenotype is king. So in the UK, the cattle industry structure, I suspect, is probably similar to a lot of other countries, but a lot of the beef, the prime beef, actually originates from the dairy herd, and about half of all the beef in the UK comes from the dairy herd in one form or another. So you can see we've got a dairy herd on the left and a beef herd on the right. Many of the beef sucklers are crossbred dairy, and then they're mated to a beef bull to produce prime beef down at the bottom. But you can see that, you know, a large chunk of it is there's 300,000 male Holsteins, and then a combination of males and females, cross beef. A lot of dairy cows are crossed with beef cattle, beef bulls to produce these offspring. The beef improvement program predominantly is the pedigree sector over here doing performance recording. So that brings us on to the projects that I'm going to talk to you about. There are two of them. They're closely related, but they're predominantly the same. One is using carcass trait data on what we call the Europe grid. So this would be for live weight, carcass conformation and fat. And then we have another project where we're actually using video image analysis data captured in the abattoir by a camera. But traditionally, the recording would be done by a number of herds that engage in performance recording. They all record birth weights and 20-week weights and so on. Some of them record 400-day weight, kind of mature weight, about 5,000 a year. And some of them record ultrasound fat and muscle depth. But you can see the numbers here, 1,500 records a year. These are the kind of numbers of records, 20,000 weights, 5,400 day weights, and 1,500 ultrasound weights that constitute the genetic improvement data that's used in the UK, and all other improvement flows from that data. Relatively small numbers and only information from pedigree animals. These are proxy traits. These are meant to be predictors of traits that the farmer's going to get paid for in the abattoir. But what we're really interested in these weights here. These are the things we're interested in. And the reason why we make so much improvement in dairy cows is because we actually measure the milk production. We measure the thing we're interested in selecting for. Whereas in beef, we tend to make predictions about what we're going to get paid for from the live animal. And I think this limits the genetic improvement that's available to us. And again, particularly in the UK, and this is important for you again, I guess, is that the market signals are lost in translation. Because what the farmer breeds for, the pedigree farmer breeds for, is basically what he can sell bulls to the next layer down. And what they pay for is basically what they can sell carcasses to the abattoir on. And that market signal chain is very inefficient and can take years and years and years. It's compounded by the fact that the abattoirs change their signals every now and again. So one week, if they've got a surplus, they'll be very choosy about which animals they pay and buy and pay a premium for. The next week, if they're undersupplied, they'll just take anything that walks past the door. And this is very confusing for the farmer and equally even more consuming for the pedigree breeder. Despite that, we've managed to make some improvement over the years, weights and conformation are getting better and fat is remaining the same. So this is a successful signal. But I guess the question is, how much better could that have been if we'd have had far more records and far more data that we could use for evaluations? So this is the way that farmers are paid for the carcasses. It's a grid. I suspect most of you are very familiar with it, and I suspect you have something similar. It's called the Europe grid. It's paid on dead weight, and then you get a penalty or a premium based on how good the conformation is and what fat class. These are the proportion of animals that are in each of the classes. And you can see that pretty well, most of them need to be in this middle spot here. You can see there are still animals over here in the lower sections, and animals over here in the lower sections, animals here. I haven't got payments to show you, but basically this is the place in the middle where you get the maximum price, and as you move away from that in any of these directions, you get less money. So the target for most beef producers is to get as many of their animals in here as they possibly can. These are the differences in carcass, and I think this is probably one of the better ones that we're aiming at. But you can see, you get carcasses like this in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Again, represents one of the biggest problems for the abattoirs, the meat processors, that they have thousands of these things, all of different shapes and sizes, and they have to process them into a steak or a lump of meat that's sold in the supermarket that's consistent. And this represents a big challenge for them. In terms of profitability, I'm hoping that this message will build as we get towards the end of the presentation, that these are the proportion of animals that are in specification. And you can see back in 1996, about 42% were in spec. These were the animals that were supplied to the abattoir that were of the type that they requested or were prepared to pay the top price for. So a large number of them were not, and it's understandable because a proportion of them will be Holstein, bull surplus males, which are difficult to finish. But you can see over the years, in 20 years or so, we haven't really made an enormous amount of progress. We've increased to about half the proportion of carcasses that are in spec, but it's still about half of them that are not in spec. So that gives us big opportunities. If we could get more in the blue sector, if we could get them in spec, clearly that generates more profit for the abattoir, which generates more profit for the farmers ultimately. So going back to how could we do that? How could we bring that about? How can we actually get farmers to breed animals that are more consistent with the expectations of the processors? Well, I've already pointed out how it works, and I suspect it works like this in a lot of countries, is you've got the classic pyramid where all the selection and improvement and performance recording goes on up here, and they work their way down the pyramid into the commercial sector here. Now, one of the problems of the UK pedigree sector is the contemporary groups are very small. Often a farmer may have a herd of 100 cows, but only 10 of them will be in the pedigree group. And so the contemporary groups that we have to produce genetic evaluations are often small, and we lose a lot of records through incomplete contemporary groups. The pedigree information is sometimes poor, but mostly good. There are herds that do a good job on pedigree recording. There are others that don't. How good is it? Well, I'll come back to that in a little while. One of the things about genotyping, it gives you some information about who's the daddy, and we can use that information. Now, in the UK, we had a little hiccup some years ago called BSE, which led to the British Cattle Movement Service being produced. And again, you have something similar in Canada, where all the animals have to be recorded by law. And there are a large number of animals in that database with a very rich female parentage, because it's compulsory to record the dam, but it's not compulsory to record the sire. So out of the millions of animals in here, there's a lot less veracity of the data on the sire side. Now, what we've tried to do, or tried to think about in terms of carcass data, is tipping this on its head. We spent millions of dollars over the last 30 years trying to convince farmers to do more performance recording and make greater use of EBVs in an attempt to force genetic improvement down the pyramid. If the idea was, if you had lots of improvement at the top, it will spill over and work its way down the pyramid and improve the commercial population generally. Well, despite my youthful appearance, I haven't got long left, really. And I need to make some impact quite quickly. So I figure that this is a better approach. So rather than trying to force stuff down the pyramid, we're now focusing on the commercial sector in an attempt to suck improvement up the pyramid, okay? The idea is that if we attack this group here and create the right commercial signals, the right market signals, they will demand the right type of bull from this sector, and they will demand the right type of bull from the pedigree sector. And that should change the selection objectives in the pedigree sector. So we're now receiving data from the abattoirs on the offspring of the bulls that the commercial guys have bought from the pedigree sector. The contemporary groups are larger, the pedigree information is the same, and our BCMS data remains the same. We've just simply kind of done it the opposite way round, so we're sucking rather than pushing. This is what the system looks like. It's information that you have to put in, and the sire is not compulsory, but as I said, there's a lot more interest in it now because we've demonstrated the great value of using BCMS data in our national programme, and all of a sudden there's a huge amount of interest in recording the sire. If I'm not mistaken, a similar situation existed in Ireland some years ago, and they went from 15% sire recorded to 85% recorded in just a question of a few years because farmers could see the benefit, okay? We're also seeing, I don't know if it's spilled over into North America yet, but Genus ABS have got a campaign in the UK called Who's the Daddy? And they actually, on all of their AI catalogues, they print the UK ear tag number of the bull that the farmer is using semen from, so that when they put the passports into the national system, they can put the UK ear tag number, and that increases the number of records that we have. Basically, we take all of the data available to us from all these national databases and we merge them together, and we use the single identifier, the ear tag number, to put the records together. And there are millions of records in these data. We're currently getting millions of records from the abattoirs. We've got BCMS that's got a large number of records in, and we can join them together, and we can also construct records that don't exist anywhere else. So there are databases that have got one piece of data on an animal. There are other databases that have got other pieces of information on the same animal. And the only database that's got all of the data from all of the animals is what we use in the national evaluations. And that's what gives us the data that we can go on and do this sort of thing with. We've taken all of the BCMS and the BASCO, this is the beef performance recording. We've got all the dairy records from the milk recording organisation. And we put them all together and produced this super pedigree, which contains 65 million animal records for the whole of the UK, where all the records are sort of joined in one big national pedigree. We can then pull data from each of as subsets from each of that for each particular thing that we're doing. So what might we do with that? Well, we've got our super pedigree, and then we get data from the abattoir. Okay, we get a range of bits of data, and as I said earlier, we get VIA data, which gives us data on the primal yields, and I'll move on to that in a minute. But we also get on large numbers of animals, on about 50% of the UK kill, we get the weight, the grade, and the conformation. And that gives us information that we can produce carcass trait EBVs. So what does the data look like once we merge it together? And I mentioned earlier, didn't I, that about half of the beef comes from the dairy herd. And you can see here, this is 1 to 5 and 6 to 10. When you look at the slaughter generation and count up who their mothers are, as it were, it's about half, almost half of all of the mothers of the beef going into the kill is Holstein. Limousin's a big breed in the UK, followed by the usual, Angus and Simmentals. But relative to these breeds over here, the rest of them don't add up to much. So pretty well, it's Holstein, Limousin, and Angus that make up a large chunk of the UK beef. Now, just coincidentally, it's not part of my talk, so I'm ad-libbing a bit here, but we're also doing some work on looking to improve the carcass characteristics of the Holstein, because clearly, if you can influence both sides of the equation, you can actually improve the carcass characteristics of the offspring. Ironically, Holsteins with slightly improved carcass characteristics for beef are actually more resilient, more fertile, more healthy. So it's a bit of a win-win situation there if we can actually combine the beef characteristics of the Holstein and the beef herd. We can actually get some wins all round there. The carcass trait EBVs that we're producing, the project finishes in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll be making these available to the industry soon after. One of the problems with carcass weight as an EBV is that carcass weight is the goal for a lot of producers, so there's no variation in it. You know, they're all trying to get the animals to the abattoir at a fixed weight. So that makes it tricky to produce breeding values for that. So we're looking at things like days to slaughter and obviously daily gain. And I've got a slide on that I think will be really interesting next. And most of the breeds and the dairy breeds will receive carcass trait EBVs before the end of this year. So what can you do with the data once you've got it together that actually helps support the idea of selection? So this is a slide or graph that we produced from the data a couple of years back, but it shows the age at slaughter for, these are males and females. So this is males and these are females, and these are the record counts, okay? And if you look at the record count here, there's 350,000 animals. So this is a pretty robust distribution. And over here, we're talking of 50,000 at this end here. But you can see that pretty well all animals get to around about almost their mature weight by about 15 months of age. And a large chunk of animals, a huge chunk of animals, are kept to this point here because 350 is the target carcass weight. You can see the peak in numbers. But you can see there's a large number of animals kept for another 9 months to put on about half a dozen kilos. And what that represents is a colossal waste to the UK beef industry. It also represents a colossal amount of pollution that those animals are doing, they're putting out, while they're being kept to gain a few kilos. So if we're going to talk about profitability in the beef industry, if we're going to talk about efficiency, how difficult is it to do? Well, it's easy. Okay, your beef farmers should be a lot more profitable than they are simply by using data like this to demonstrate the futility of keeping animals for an extended period of time. Now, I don't know if many of you were here yesterday. I asked a question of the Economist about risk, the value of risk. Okay, so you've got tens of thousands of animals being kept for 9 months. So you multiply that by their value, multiply it by the risk of one of them dying. I suspect this, in terms of risk, must amount to millions of dollars for keeping thousands of animals for months when they could have been sent off to the abattoir. Okay, it's a really important graph, this one. And I think this is something that you could easily do in Canada. And I throw down the gauntlet to you. Get the data, produce that graph, and I'd be very surprised if Canadian beef production wasn't very similar to that one. Okay, so please prove me wrong, but I guess I'll not be. When you break it down into the different breeds, you can see there's variation in the different breeds. I always throw this one in just to create a bit of an argument between the different keepers of the different breeds. But you can see dairy here and Limousin up here and Angus in the middle. But the story is the same, you know, that they reach a great degree of their mature weight quite early on. And then for whatever reason, and we can discuss the reasoning afterwards, if somebody can think of a good reason, farmers tend to keep them for a long time just to put that last little bit of finish on them. Whereas economically, my guess is somewhere like that would be the optimum point for getting rid of them. And of course, the emissions from animals that are kept too long is going to be enormous. So if we're talking about trying to show that the beef industry has got good credentials in terms of methane emissions, here's an opportunity to reduce the methane emissions per kilogram of product enormously through selecting animals that you can slaughter more quickly. In some of the abattoirs we work with, they now have installed these machines which take photographs of the carcass at the end of the line, and the software can then virtually break the carcass down into primals. Okay, it can tell you how much is in each one of these bits. And for the Limousin breed that we work with, they were really interested in the possibility of extending this bit here, because this is the strip loin. It's the highest value cut on the whole carcass. And if you think about it, the ideal carcass would be as long in the back as you could get it, would have as least mount at the front as you could get it, and the shortest possible legs as you could get it. And I guess really a Limousin animal that looked like a pig would be ideal and weighed 350 kilos. Might take a few years to get there, but that's the general direction of travel. We don't want to make the carcasses bigger, we just want to increase the proportion of high-value meat in a particular carcass. So we started this project 4 years ago, and part of the project was to genotype a number of animals for which this data was available as well. Going back to the carcasses, this is some data coming out of Ireland from Thierry Pabieu, and they came up with some heritabilities to show that these dark grey bits are the kind of high-value cuts and the white bits are the low-value cuts. But you can see strip loin has got a heritability of 0.49, sirloin 0.67. These are good heritabilities in indicating that you can select for these things and bring about change. So the idea would be make that bit longer and this bit smaller, this bit bigger, and so on. So when we go and look at the data that we've collected, we say, okay, we've got, I think, I can't remember exactly how many, about 85,000 records, and we wanted to look to see what the variation was at a given carcass weight. If we take right in the middle there, 350, you can see there are carcasses that weigh 350 kilos with a strip loin of 4 kilograms, and others of the same carcass weight with a strip loin of 18 kilograms. Well, strip loin in the UK retails at about £35, I guess $60-something a kilo. So the difference between there and there represents a large amount of money. Now, of course, one of the criticisms at that time when we did this was, but animals that have got better conformation are going to have better strip loins. So if you look here, animals of any particular conformation score have small strip loins and big strip loins, okay? So there's variation in strip loin whichever way you look at it. When we go on to think about how we can differentiate the carcasses, when you multiply each of the kilograms of the pieces of the carcass by their retail value, okay, this is retail, this is what would happen in the supermarket, not at the abattoir, a 750 quid difference between the best and the worst. Any one kind of score there. But of course, that's a little bit of an artificial thing. What we're interested in, for the Limousin breed anyway, for animals that are in the right weight range, what's the difference? Well, the difference there is 300 pounds. So then we want to filter that a bit more and say, but actually we want to remove all the poor conformation ones, because Limousins generally don't have poor conformation. But after you take all of those out, you still end up with the difference between the worst and the best of 100 quid. So these are animals that were all of the same weight, the same conformation, and the same fat score, and so the farmer got paid the same amount of money for the animal. But when the abattoir chopped them up all into pieces and weighted them by their economic value, the difference was 100 quid. So that's profitability that is available to the industry. If all of the animals in one of those boxes on the grid were at the top end of that box, this is the amount of money that would be available. And when you multiply that up by thousands of animals, the value becomes enormous. But you can see the heritabilities that we got for the different traits are very similar to those that Thierry got. So we're quite content that the data and the modelling is correct, and that we can select for these different shaped animals. So then moving on to what does it look like in terms of sires? Well, the difference between the breeding value of the top half a dozen and the bottom half a dozen, this is a 30 Limousin sires with 50 offspring each in the data and so on, and the difference there was 460 quid in retail value difference between the top and the bottom. Okay, so that tells you what's available for selection. If you're going to select a Limousin bull, my guess is you'd be interested in these ones here rather than these ones here. In terms of genomics, which I guess is a part of the discussion we have here, we've got about 2,700 Limousin genotypes for which we have phenotype data. Some of them are on the 50K, but there are about 700 on the high density. We've currently got a reasonably sized reference population, and the prediction accuracy is about 65%. What that also gives us the opportunity to do, and we're doing this right now, is looking at building on this project to include other traits such as meat quality. And again, one of the benefits of embarking upon this process is that we can use the genotypes and the phenotypes as a platform to launch other work. So what are the implications? I think this is the more important thing. The implications here, that these are massive benefits to the industry. The calculations we've done, the calculations were in Scotland alone, increasing the strip line by 4% was worth £20 million. Okay, so you could do the calculations for Canada. If all of your cattle had 1 centimetre more strip loin, just do the calculations. It's colossal. The amount of money is huge. We now work with large numbers of records, and so the accuracies of EBVs are far better. We're working with traits of importance. We're working with economic traits now. We're working with traits that farmers get paid for, not predictions of, not proxies for, things that farmers get paid for, which makes the explanation a lot better. One of the most important things is that we've now got a strong link in the supply chain between pedigree Limousin breeders and the abattoir. And that information flows up and down regularly, that we meet 8 times a year with the abattoir about this project. Okay, so there's very strong connections between the pedigree breeders and the final product, which is what they're trying to produce. I've already showed you that using the same data, you can actually start looking at greenhouse gas emissions. So the things that are important or will be important in the future, such as the environmental impact of your beef production industry, you can actually quantify some of that from the data that you generate through this approach. These are the first EBVs of their kind, but there are also, more importantly, this is a kind of landmark for the UK beef industry. These are the first genomic breeding values that the UK beef industry will have available to them. And as I mentioned earlier, because of the tight integration between the research group and the implementation group, we now have genomic breeding values available to breeders before the project that produced them is finished. Okay, this is a really important thing. This is the kind of way things are going, is that rather than doing some research and waiting for some years afterwards for implementation, in the UK there's now demand that these things get implemented before the project is finished. And this is the first one that we've been able to do that. Now, one of the things that we can pick up in discussion is if we can generate this value in the supply chain, going back to the title of my presentation, if we can generate value, how do we distribute it amongst the players in an equitable and fair way? It's the market. It will find its level. The money will spread up and down accordingly. But it might be a good opportunity for us to think about how we might intervene to make sure that farmers get a reasonable share of it, the processors get a reasonable share, and the pedigree breeder gets a reasonable share. So in conclusion, this was an industry-focused and developed project. It was driven by an abattoir. Actually, the abattoir came to us and said, we've got this information, we'd like to do a project on using it. Okay, so that they were the drivers of this. It's now large scale with big data sets, and we heard a comment yesterday about quality. Well, as geneticists, when you've got 1 million records, you can do an awful lot with it, whether it's good quality or bad quality. Now, it's all good quality stuff anyway, and I would say, how do you know that the data you use in your current genetic evaluations is good quality anyway? The weights that are taken by your pedigree breeders that they send to you and use in your evaluations, who's to say they're any good anyway? So I'd say I wouldn't be scared of the quality of the data. I'd say get hold of it and use it because the volumes of it means that you're going to blow the quality problem out of the water. Results will be available in a few weeks' time, and it does provide us with a solid platform to now go on and look at other things, such as, and we're heavily embroiled with Genomes Canada and with other groups on feed efficiency, female fertility traits, and things like meat quality, and you can imagine this going on and on and on. So I think, Mr. Chairman, that's it for me. Acknowledge all of the people involved in this project and all of the abattoirs involved in supplying us data for the other project. Okay, that's a really good point, and that's the crux of this project, isn't it? Is that you can imagine a scenario where the abattoir would know out of 1,000 animals that were in one of those boxes, they paid the same amount of money for all 1,000 of them, but some of them are worth 100 quid more than the others. That's a piece of information that the abattoirs really want to hang on to. Yeah? Now, the reason why in this particular case they're keen that that market signal goes up to the Limousin breeders is because the same abattoir have got animals in the other boxes, and they don't want those animals. What they want is a greater supply, consistent supply of animals that they know will be at the top end of one of those boxes that will have the maximum retail value in each of their carcasses. And that's why they've connected up with the Limousin Society to do exactly that. And it's quite likely that their buyers, when they go out to the markets, are going to start to look for offspring of bulls that have got high retail value EBVs and GBVs. Yeah? So it's a really good question, and that actually, defines what we're trying to do, that the abattoir could, if they wanted to, hang on to all of this, but it does mean then that they're not sending a market signal. And in this case, they've chosen to send a market signal that they want the breeders to respond to. One of the reasons why I was really interested in this project is because ultimately somebody somewhere is going to pass a law that says farmers have to pay for the methane they produce. So before that point, it makes sense for farmers to have tools to enable them to mitigate against it. If all of these animals were over here, the reduction in methane would be colossal. I haven't done the calculation, but it's huge. You calculate the economic loss of all farmers in this lot, 350,000 animals for an entire year. You multiply that up, it's worth millions of pounds. And I think that's the overwhelming argument, is that by keeping animals a long time to finish them, is costing money, it's creating pollution, and it's increasing the risk, because if one of them dies, for a farmer, it's a huge amount. It's a big lumpy cost, isn't it? They don't die in little pieces across the period of time. If they die a week before you send them off to the abattoir, it's a huge loss. And as I said yesterday, the probability of dying increases the longer you live. So my expectation would be send them off to the abattoir as fast as you can.